The mansion was never meant to feel so desolate. Jack Turner lingered in the threshold of the sprawling estate, clutching the old brass key his father Henry had left him. Outside, a tempest raged, a wild symphony of howling wind, lashing rain, and booming thunder that seemed to echo the sorrow in his heart. The grand home, once a beacon of warmth and laughter, now loomed like a silent sentinel on the edge of a storm-ravaged cliff. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and ancient timber, a pungent reminder of days gone by. In every gust of wind and every flicker of lightning, Jack could almost hear the echo of his father's hearty voice, reminiscing about sunlit Sunday mornings spent in a bustling kitchen where every corner of the house sang with memories of love and family. But tonight, that cherished symphony was replaced by an oppressive solitude. Jack had never imagined returning to inherit a legacy so burdened with grief, nor had he expected to stand alone before this once vibrant sanctuary. Determined to honor his father's memory, he took a resolute step toward the mansion, his heart set on reclaiming the home that had cradled his childhood. Yet before he could cross the threshold, a sharp voice sliced through the roar of the storm. "You have no right to be here," it thundered. Spinning around, Jack's pulse quickened as he faced a formidable figure emerging from the shadows of the rain-soaked courtyard. There, illuminated by a brief, searing flash of lightning, stood a woman with a perfectly styled blonde bob. Dressed in a sharply tailored suit that glistened even under the deluge, she exuded an unyielding air of authority. Her eyes narrowed in disdain, and her lips curled into a sneer that rivaled the bitter cold of the wind. With the precision of someone used to commanding boardrooms rather than battlefields, she advanced. "Excuse me," Jack managed, his voice steadier than he felt as his fingers gripped the brass key tighter. "I inherited this mansion from my father." The woman scoffed dismissively. "Inherited? Hardly. The real owner isn't present, and I'm not about to let you waltz in and claim what isn't yours," she declared, her tone laced with contempt. Jack's heart pounded painfully as he struggled to process her words. Memories of whispered warnings about a meddlesome neighbor named Karen flooded back. Never had he imagined her to be so ruthless. Before he could respond, Karen produced a sleek smartphone from her clutch and began tapping furiously. "I'm reporting a trespasser," she announced coolly into the device, her gaze fixed on him with icy intensity. "There's a man breaking into his neighbor's home, and he refuses to leave." But the irony was bitter. Jack was no interloper, but the rightful heir of this very place. As the first police sirens pierced the tumultuous night, their wail mingling with the cacophony of the storm, Jack felt his anger swell. Determined to prove his legitimacy, he stepped forward, his voice rising above the tumult. "Karen? You're mistaken. I have every document, my name is on the deed, every piece of proof is in my possession." But Karen's response was a cold, dismissive sneer. "Until the authorities verify it, I'm not letting you settle in your inheritance," she spat, her words as sharp as the stinging rain. In that charged moment, amidst nature's fury and the glaring headlights of approaching police vehicles, Jack realized that his return had turned into a battlefield. The mansion, once a cherished refuge, now became the stage for a bitter confrontation, a clash between a grieving son determined to honor his father's legacy and a vindictive Karen hell-bent on exploiting every opportunity for her own gain. With the storm raging around them, Jack tightened his grip on the brass key, vowing that no matter how fierce the opposition, he would reclaim the home that held the last whispers of his past. The storm had finally passed, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet grass and mud. Jack stood alone on the porch of his father's mansion, the floodlights casting long shadows across the darkened front yard. The house, despite its looming presence, felt eerily empty. His fingertips still clenched around the brass key, but now that the confrontation had played out, it seemed symbolically heavy. Instead of an heirloom of legacy, it felt like a weight dragging him further into the solitary abyss of grief. It had been hours since the sheriff, Adam Coleman, arrived at the scene. Jack had hoped for reassurance, that the distant and seemingly uncomplicated nature of legalities would suffice, but instead, it had been a battlefield. The sheriff, ever the unflinching figure of authority that commanded respect in their tiny town, stood now between Jack and Karen, his childhood friend who hadn't spoken to him in years, and strived to diffuse the escalating tensions. The faintest traces of recognition from the sheriff had taken Jack by surprise, peeling away the thick layer of suspicion Karen had built around herself. "It's Henry's boy," the sheriff had murmured, his voice softening just enough for Jack to feel a brief flicker of affection behind those years of hardened experience. But of course that flicker vanished the moment Karen had spoken up. "Thank God you're here, Sheriff," she had practically shrieked, her voice cutting through the night as sharp as the distant howl of the wind. "I caught this man breaking into Henry Turner's home. He refuses to leave, and I fear for my safety." Jack had clenched his jaw in disbelief as Karen expertly manipulated the situation, turning on the theatrics to paint herself as the victim yet again. She'd practically stormed past him, arms crossed, challenging his every word and every movement made toward the house. The irony of her accusations was almost too much to bear. He wasn't the one trespassing. "Yes, this is Henry Turner's house," she continued, glaring at Jack with venom in her eyes, as if she could deny the truth with nothing more than malice. "Oh, and by the way, my dear Sheriff, you should know that Henry didn't have any family left here. There's no one who would claim this place." Her voice dripped with false sincerity, and Jack noticed then that her carefully chosen words danced suspiciously close to the truth, but didn't land there. Jack had finally stepped forward, though the helplessness was creeping under the surface of every movement. He hung his wallet up, revealing his ID, the proof he had been trusted with the family property, and showed Sheriff Coleman his inheritance. A smile tugging at his strained lips. "He left this house to me," Jack said, and he did his best to make it sound like the unshakable fact it was. Sheriff Coleman had paused just long enough for recognition to flicker in his eyes. "Henry's kid, huh?" he asked, squinting at Jack as if trying to place the face in the aging snapshot of his memory. Jack nodded bitterly, his heart swelling with the gravity of those memories he wasn't ready to lose yet. But Karen wasn't backing down. Her critique sent a chill down Jack's spine. "He could have faked this," she sneered, refocusing the sheriff's attention. "How do we know this isn't some elaborate scam?" She turned her glare onto him, as if Jack himself had sabotaged everything from the other end. Jack, gritty with anger and tired after the long drive, clenched his fists. This wasn't just about property ownership. This was about Karen, the neighbor, who'd sprawled through their town like sickness, always creating trouble where none existed. Yet, despite her endless attempts to twist the truth, Jack faced the sheriff only with measured determination. "You've seen the paper, Sheriff. The deed. My name's on it." The sheriff raised a weary brow at Karen's repeated protests. "Karen, unless you've got some actual legal grounds," he urged, pressing her, a reminder of the town's loyalty to Henry's memory. He'd once been a friend to her, too, after all, but time had made clear to him who stood at the heart of the matter. The situation had, for now, seemed temporarily suspended by Sheriff Coleman's words, but Jack had the feeling Karen was calculating her next move, her mind working endlessly. The air crackled with faceless rage as she turned on her heel, shooting a glare at Jack sharp enough to wound before storming off into the night. The sheriff handed Jack his documents back, the frustration palpable in his eyes. Jack was too worn, but more than anything, he was resolute. Gritting his teeth, he stood firm. "You planning on staying long?" the sheriff asked. Jack looked back at the house, feeling the weight of everything, the storm, the house, his father's legacy. He wasn't sure, but for now, he wouldn't let her win. "For now," Jack said quietly, the storm inside his heart matching the weather outside. "For 36 seconds. In the waning moments of the storm's fury, as rain turned to a persistent drizzle and thunder faded into distant rumbles, a familiar figure from Jack's past emerged from the gloom. Sheriff Adam Coleman, whose stern features still bore traces of the man he once was, only now marked by strands of silver, approached the property with a measured, resolute gait. His eyes, sharp yet compassionate, took in the charged scene, Jack standing on the threshold of his late father's mansion, the brass key clutched tightly in his hand, and Karen, ever defiant, her posture radiating unyielding authority. "What seems to be the problem here?" the sheriff asked evenly, glancing between the two, as remnants of the tempest still whispered around them. Without hesitation, Karen launched into her narrative, her voice clipped and insistent. "Thank goodness you're here, Sheriff. I caught this man trying to break into Henry Turner's home. He refused to leave, and I feared for my safety." Her words, harsh and accusatory, stung Jack as deeply as the bitter wind. It wasn't just the intrusion, it was the way Karen had stormed onto his property, bulldozing past any semblance of decency to seize control of the moment. Her claim painted him as an interloper in his own inheritance, a distortion that cut into the core of his grief and longing. Sheriff Coleman's gaze shifted thoughtfully to Jack. "Henry Turner's house, you say?" he inquired, his eyebrow arching in measured skepticism. Karen nodded emphatically, adding that she was well aware Henry had no living kin in the area, insinuating that Jack's claim was a fabrication. Steeling himself, Jack took a deliberate step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of calm compliance. "Sheriff, my name is Jack Turner. Henry was my father. I've just driven in from Portland to settle everything regarding this house. I have the will, the deed, every document that proves I am its rightful owner." The sheriff reached into his memories as he examined Jack's ID, his expression softening as recognition dawned. "Henry, boy," he murmured, a nostalgic warmth seeping into his tone. "I remember when your father would bring you into town, and you'd light up every corner with that mischievous smile." Jack managed a small nod, reaffirming his connection to those happier days, even as Karen's eyes narrowed in disbelief. "Oh, come on, Sheriff," she interjected sharply, her tone dripping with derision. "How do you know? It isn't some elaborate scam. He could have easily forged these documents." Coleman's tired yet resolute gaze turned to Karen. "I knew Henry, and I know you, Karen. Unless you have something concrete, some legitimate legal reason to dispute this, I suggest you step aside." Her face flushed an angry, furious red as she stuttered about having checked on Henry when no one else did, asserting that his carelessness left the property to her. Jack's calm retort cut through her claims. "If my father had intended for you to inherit his home, he would have put your name in his will." With a resigned sigh, Sheriff Coleman declared, "It's over, and if you cause any more trouble, we'll have another conversation, one you won't enjoy." With one final icy glare, Karen spun on her heel and stalked off into the dark, rain-drenched night. The sheriff returned the documents to Jack and asked quietly, "Are you planning on staying here?" Jack hesitated, his eyes lingering on the mansion, a repository of a lifetime's worth of memories, both sweet and sorrowful. "At least until I figure everything out," he replied, a note of steely determination in his voice. As the sheriff's cruiser disappeared down the slick road, Jack remained alone on the porch, gazing out over the shadowed fields stretching into the night. Though the land lay silent, his mind churned with the knowledge that Karen's battle was far from over. The morning light would reveal new challenges, and as dawn broke, Jack awoke to an eerie calm that shattered in an instant a loud, ominous thunk on the front porch. His heart pounded as he pulled on his hoodie and stepped into the crisp, unforgiving morning air, fully aware that the war for his father's legacy had only just begun. Jack's heart sank as he stepped onto the porch, only to be met with the foul stench of garbage. His stomach twisted at the sight before him, torn garbage bags scattered across the steps, rotting food spilling out, papers crumpled and shredded, and shards of broken glass glittering menacingly in the weak light of the early morning. The nauseating smell, sour and rancid, seeped into the air, thick enough to choke him. It made his eyes burn and his stomach churn. He couldn't believe his eyes. In the middle of the mess was a neatly folded piece of paper, almost deliberate in its simplicity, almost mocking. As Jack bent to pick it up, the words written in hurried, jagged script stood out, a command that sent a cold shiver down his spine. "This town doesn't belong to strangers. Leave." For a moment, Jack stood frozen, clutching the paper in disbelief, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ground together. The bitterness in his chest swelled as the realization hit him. Karen had made her intentions clear. This wasn't some petty feud between neighbors. No, it had escalated far beyond that. It was war, and she had declared the first of many strikes. Jack's hands trembled with a mix of anger and frustration. He could feel the hot sting of humiliation creeping up inside him as he stepped over the garbage to reach the door. Everything he'd tried to rebuild in his father's home, the place that should have been his sanctuary, had already been marred. But Jack knew exactly what Karen wanted. She wanted him to react, to snap. She wanted him to storm into town and make a scene. That way, she would have the upper hand, playing the innocent victim for anyone who would listen. But Jack wasn't about to give her that satisfaction. Taking a slow, deliberate breath to steady himself, Jack thought, rationally, he would not be provoked. He would not let her win by making him look like the enemy. Instead, he grabbed a pair of rubber gloves from the hallway closet and set to work. For the next half hour, his mind churned, but his hands stayed busy cleaning up the trash, scrubbing away the chaos that Karen had tried so hard to impose upon him. The anger didn't dissipate, not by a long shot. It simmered beneath the surface, but at least for a while he had something to focus on. He would calm himself, gather his strength, and prepare for the next battle. He would not let Karen tear him apart. By the time Jack had cleaned the porch and discarded the garbage, a new resolve formed within him. Karen wanted to make this personal, to turn his life into a war zone. He could feel it, and he wasn't about to let her win without a fight. She wanted to break him? Fine, let her try. Jack climbed behind the wheel of his truck and drove straight for the county records office. The stale smell of old papers and faded coffee filled the air as he entered the building. Behind the desk, an older woman with reading glasses peered up from the paperwork she was meticulously organizing. She looked at the rugged man who stood before her, and her eyes softened. "Can I help you?" she asked, politeness in her voice. Jack glanced down at the papers in his hand and nodded. "Yes, I need to pull some property records. Specifically, I want to check if there are any claims or liens on the Turner estate." Her sharp expression didn't falter, but her tone softened as she heard the name he mentioned. Jack Turner? Henry Turner's son? Her sympathetic look deepened as she offered her condolences, but Jack cut her off before she could continue. "Just making sure everything's in order. You see, I have this situation with someone who seems to think she has a right to the house." She sighed, shaking her head slightly. "Let me guess. Karen?" Jack blinked at her response. "It's that obvious?" "Well, honey, Karen's been poking around in everyone's business since high school. She's always been convinced this town is hers to run." The clerk muttered. "She's probably trying something shady here." She motioned for him to take a seat. Taunting her wasn't productive, but Jack couldn't help the small smirk that crossed his face. If Karen thought he could be intimidated, she didn't know who she was dealing with. As Jack sat, he felt an overwhelming sense of determination wash over him. He wasn't leaving without the proof he needed. Sure enough, the clerk returned with a thick folder. "Here you go," she said. "No claims, no disputes. Your father left it all to you. This whole property, it's all yours." Relief flooded through Jack, but it was quickly swept away by a determination so fierce he could almost feel his heart hammering in his chest. Karen had no legal standing in this. She had nothing, and now it was time to make that perfectly clear. Jack didn't return home right away. Instead, he drove straight to Sheriff Adam Coleman's office. When the sheriff looked up from his desk, Jack dropped the folder onto the desk with a satisfying thud. "What's this about?" Sheriff Coleman raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Jack's voice was calm but firm. "Not yet, but I thought I'd give you a heads up. I've got proof that Karen has zero legal claim on the house." Sheriff Coleman flipped through the pages quickly, taking in the documents before nodding once. "What am I looking at here?" "Proof," Jack said, "that Karen has no legal right to interfere with my ownership, and I don't want to deal with her harassment anymore." The sheriff leaned back in his chair and gave Jack a weary look. "She's already made a mark on this town, but this is beyond the usual nonsense. I'll keep an eye on her for you." Jack glanced at the sheriff's tired face, a small sigh escaping him. He didn't feel thankful, but he knew this fight was just beginning. "Thanks, Sheriff," Jack muttered, already turning to leave. For 31 seconds. The dawn that followed the storm's fury offered no respite for Jack Turner. As he stepped onto the porch, still reeling from the previous night's bitter confrontation, he was met with a scene that made his heart sink. Garbage bags lay strewn across the front steps, their fabric torn open to reveal a repulsive heap of rotten food, crumpled papers, and shards of broken glass. The noxious stench of decay and spilled refuse rose in a sour, rancid wave, forcing Jack to pause and cover his nose against the assault on his senses. Amid the chaos, a single, neatly folded piece of paper lay undisturbed, a jarring contrast to the surrounding disorder. With a trembling hand, he retrieved it and unfolded it to reveal a hastily scrawled note that read, "This town doesn't belong to strangers. Leave." Jack's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. He didn't need to guess who was behind this abhorrent display. It was unmistakably Karen's doing. A calculated message meant to wound and provoke. Her actions had evolved from mere neighborhood squabbles into an all-out personal vendetta. The note wasn't just trash, it was a declaration of war, a challenge thrown down at his feet. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Jack forced himself to think clearly. He realized that Karen's intent was to incite him into an emotional outburst, to make him storm into town and publicly lash out so that she could bask in the role of the aggrieved victim among her cronies. But Jack Turner was not that man. Instead, he reached for a pair of heavy-duty gloves from the hallway closet, rolled up his sleeves, and set about cleaning the mess. For the next half hour, Jack methodically collected the debris, his every movement a silent rebuttal to Karen's attempts at intimidation. The anger that simmered beneath his skin refused to subside, but he channeled it into action, meticulously restoring a semblance of order to the steps that had once borne the legacy of his father. With each bag of garbage he tied up and each shard of glass he swept away, he reaffirmed his determination to defend his rightful home. The physical labor became a cathartic act, a way to regain control over a situation that was spiraling into chaos. Once the front steps were cleared, Jack's mind raced with plans and countermeasures. Karen had no legal claim on the property. Her tactics were mere bluster designed to scare him off. With this resolve in mind, he set out later that day with a new purpose. Driving to the county records office, a place redolent of old paper and the lingering aroma of stale coffee, Jack was determined to ensure that every document would back his claim. Inside, the office's atmosphere was quiet and deliberate. A middle-aged clerk with reading glasses perched on her nose looked up as he approached the counter. "Can I help you?" she inquired politely. Jack replied with calm urgency. "Yes, I need to pull up some property records for the Turner estate. I want to check if there are any claims or liens against it." Her face softened as she recalled, "Henry Turner was a good man. I'm sorry for your loss." Offering a tight smile in return, Jack explained the recent events about a certain Karen who now believed she had some right to the home. With a knowing sigh, the clerk shook her head and murmured, "Let me guess. Karen? She's been meddling since high school, acting like she runs this town." After a short wait by a side desk, she returned with a thick folder. "There are no claims, no disputes," she stated firmly. "Your father left the house and the land entirely to you." Relief surged through Jack, yet it was quickly replaced by a sharper determination. Karen had no legal basis for her harassment, and it was now time to make that unequivocally clear. Not content to let the matter rest, Jack's next stop was Sheriff Adam Coleman's office. He needed to ensure that every bit of evidence was on record, that Karen's intimidation tactics would be met with official scrutiny. In this relentless battle for his father's legacy, Jack Turner resolved that he would stand his ground, no matter how fierce the opposition. Karen's war was a losing fight, and he would not back down from reclaiming what was rightfully his. After his tense meeting with Sheriff Coleman and the reassuring confirmation of his rightful inheritance, Jack thought the worst was behind him, yet Karen's vendetta was far from over. That very morning, as the sun struggled to pierce through the lingering storm clouds, Jack discovered a fresh act of aggression waiting on his doorstep. His front steps, once a quiet testament to his father's legacy, were now strewn with torn garbage bags. The bags lay in disarray, their contents spilling out in a grotesque display of rotten food, crumpled papers, and jagged shards of broken glass. The stench was immediate and overwhelming, a sour, rancid assault that brought tears to his eyes and turned his stomach. Amid the chaos, his gaze fell upon a neatly folded piece of paper, its surface scrawled with a single, ominous message. "This town doesn't belong to strangers. Leave." Jack's jaw clenched painfully at the sight. He knew full well that only Karen could have orchestrated such a deliberate act. It was more than a mere act of vandalism. It was a declaration of war, a calculated attempt to intimidate him into abandoning his rightful home. The bitterness of the message stoked the simmering anger within him. Yet, as he stood there for a long, silent moment, Jack realized that Karen was trying to force him into a rash, public outburst, a reaction that would let her portray herself as the aggrieved victim to the whole town. Refusing to play into her hands, Jack steadied himself, took a slow, deep breath, and resolved to fight back methodically rather than emotionally. Determined not to let Karen's provocations derail him, Jack donned a pair of heavy-duty gloves and began to clean up the mess. With deliberate, measured movements, he gathered the scattered refuse, bagging every piece of garbage and every shard of broken glass. Each sweep of the broom and every rustle of the plastic bags was a quiet defiance against Karen's intimidation tactics. As he worked, his mind raced with plans, strategies not just for reclaiming his home, but for building a documented case against her harassment. Later that evening, still buoyed by the resolve forged during that painstaking cleanup, Jack returned to the porch. He sat down with a cold beer in hand, attempting to relax and collect his thoughts as twilight deepened into night. But his moment of respite was abruptly shattered by the glare of headlights. A sleek, black SUV rolled into the driveway, its tires crunching over the gravel with deliberate intent. Out stepped Karen, her expression smug and self-assured, as if she had orchestrated this confrontation all along. Yet she wasn't alone. Following closely behind her was a sharply dressed man, exuding the cold calculation of a seasoned lawyer. He adjusted his tie as he approached the porch, his gaze locked on Jack with an intensity that spoke volumes. "Good evening, Mr. Turner," the lawyer began, extending a hand in a gesture that seemed both courteous and calculated. "I'm David Brooks, representing Miss Karen Miller. We believe that due to Miss Miller's close relationship with your late father, she has a valid claim on this property." Jack crossed his arms and allowed a small, defiant smirk to play on his lips. "Is that so?" he replied, his tone laced with dry amusement. "Karen claims that she and my father had plans for this house, and that everything was to be left to her? Karen lifted her chin, her voice dripping with feigned emotion as she insisted. Henry and I were very close. David Brooks continued smoothly. A verbal agreement, especially between close partners, can sometimes hold legal weight. If your father promised Miss Miller this property in any form, there might be grounds to contest your inheritance. Jack couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. Cute argument, he retorted, but the property records I pulled today leave no room for debate. There's nothing to back her claim. David's face remained impassive for a moment before he countered. That may be, but a court might view these matters with more nuance. Your father's verbal promises could be interpreted differently. Jack's smirk widened as he replied, and a court would surely not take kindly to someone who calls the cops on the rightful owner, dumps trash on his porch, and tries to strong-arm him out of his inheritance. The lawyer's confident expression faltered ever so slightly, and Karen's mask of calm cracked for a brief second under the weight of his words. David cleared his throat. It seems we may need to reassess the legal standing here before proceeding further. Karen's eyes widened in shock, and Jack leaned back against the railing, arms crossed, his gaze steady and unyielding. Do your worst, he murmured. I'm ready for whatever comes next. In that charged moment, the porch became more than just a threshold. It was the battleground where Jack Turner stood resolute, determined to defend his father's legacy against every act of intimidation thrown his way. Jack's defiant smirk had barely faded when David Brooks, the lawyer representing Karen, adjusted his briefcase with a curt nod and muttered, We'll be in touch, Mr. Turner. With that, he turned on his heel, making a swift retreat to his waiting SUV, leaving behind a simmering Karen whose eyes burned with fury. For a split second, Jack half expected her to scream, but instead she clenched her fists, shot him a glare sharp enough to slice steel, and stormed off after David as the SUV roared to life and sped down the driveway. Jack exhaled deeply, releasing breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. A small victory, yet a reminder that this skirmish was far from over. He knew all too well that Karen wouldn't quit without a fight. The following day, while in town to pick up some supplies, Jack couldn't help but notice the whispers that followed him like shadows. In the corner of a small general store, a couple of locals exchanged furtive glances and hushed murmurs the moment he passed by. Their eyes darted away awkwardly, and Jack sighed inwardly. It was clear that Karen's smear campaign had already taken root. Her relentless vendetta was working overtime, turning neighbors into conspirators of doubt. Determined not to let these baseless rumors define him, Jack steeled himself and made a mental note to keep his head down while he formulated his next move. That evening, just before dusk, there came a sharp knock on his door. Opening it, Jack found a middle-aged man, clad in a neon yellow vest, clipboard in hand, who introduced himself as Doug from the city's Code Enforcement Department. Jack Turner, he asked, scanning his clipboard, as though he had stumbled upon a grave mistake. I'm here because we've received multiple complaints about your property violating local ordinances. We need to conduct an inspection. Jack blinked in disbelief. Violations? He'd just moved in, and every inch of the property still bore his father's careful touch. Doug shrugged nonchalantly and led him on a tour of the estate. As they walked the grounds, it became painfully clear that the complaints were as ridiculous as they were numerous. Karen had reported everything from excessive weeds in the backyard to potentially hazardous porch steps that, in reality, were solid and safe. Doug sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. It's obvious someone's got it out for you, he remarked sympathetically. I'll file a report saying everything's in order, but you might want to keep an eye out. Sounds like you've got a neighbor with too much time on her hands. Jack nodded, a wry smile tugging at his lips. After Doug left, he couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Karen's desperation was reaching new ludicrous heights, but he wasn't about to be bullied into submission. The next morning, Jack discovered another provocation. A flyer taped to his front door. Its message was clear and venomous. Attention neighbors, beware of Jack Turner, a suspicious new arrival with a shady past. Do we really want him here? Rolling his eyes at the amateurish attempt, Jack peeled the flyer off and crumpled it in his hand. If Karen thought she could rally the neighborhood against him with such flimsy tactics, she was sorely mistaken. That afternoon, determined to flip the narrative, Jack made his way into town and stopped at the local cafe, where a sizable crowd had gathered. Approaching the counter with quiet confidence, he ordered a coffee and then addressed the room. Hey everyone, he began, his voice steady and clear. My name's Jack Turner. My dad Henry lived here for decades and I recently inherited his house to take care of it. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to honor his legacy and be part of this community. A few heads nodded in recognition and murmurs of welcome began to ripple through the cafe. Even Alice, the friendly clerk from the records office, raised her cup in greeting. In that moment it was clear that Karen's plan to turn the town against him had backfired spectacularly. Walking out of the cafe that afternoon, Jack felt an unmistakable surge of confidence welling up inside him. His impromptu address had not only clarified his intentions, but had also won over many of the townspeople. There were still uncertainties ahead. Karen might have played her hand, but Jack knew he had a few cards left in his sleeve. With a resolute pace, he returned to his newly inherited home, prepared for whatever might come next. Sure enough, as he neared the property, he spotted Karen standing at its edge with her arms crossed in that signature unyielding manner. The late afternoon light painted long shadows across the lawn, and Jack's heart pounded with the anticipation of yet another confrontation. Approaching her with calm but firm determination, he said, "You're wasting your time, Karen. This house is mine. It's legally mine. You can call the city, the sheriff, or even the mayor, but nothing will change that." His tone was measured and confident, a stark contrast to the tension that seemed to crackle in the air. For a split second, Karen's face twitched, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt danced in her eyes. She opened her mouth to retort, but no words emerged. Jack continued, his voice even and almost gentle, as he offered her a piece of unsolicited advice. "Move on, Karen. Focus on something else. Literally anything else. Because I'm not going anywhere." It looked as though she might argue, her eyes narrowing further, but then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed off. Jack watched her go, feeling a strange mix of relief and anticipation. He knew that while this particular skirmish was over, Karen's vendetta was far from finished. She was simply biding her time, regrouping for the next round of her relentless campaign. The next morning, the world seemed unusually calm as Jack sat on his front porch with a steaming cup of coffee. The rising sun bathed the landscape in gentle warmth, and the quiet, peaceful expanse of the land finally began to feel like home again. Yet, he remained wary. Karen was not someone who gave up easily, and he knew that her temporary retreat was only the prelude to another bout of mischief. But there was a silver lining. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Word of Karen's antics had spread like wildfire. Following his candid speech at the cafe, neighbors had started approaching him with nods of recognition, kind words, and even offers to help with small tasks around the property. People began sharing their own stories of Karen's long history of meddling in property disputes and staging unnecessary neighborhood interventions. It turned out that Karen had been a thorn in the side of the community for years, and now Jack, albeit unwittingly, had become the underdog everyone rallied around. The tension finally came to a head at the town council meeting a week later. Jack hadn't intended to attend, but a tip from a local warned him that Karen was planning to make a formal complaint against him. When he walked into the buzzing town hall, he found Karen at the front, speaking in her overly dramatic tone, painting herself as the perpetual victim of some grave injustice. "If we let this behavior go unchecked," she declared, "it will set a dangerous precedent for our community." Jack couldn't help but smile. Waiting for the right moment, he raised his hand and asked, "May I respond?" The council members exchanged glances and nodded in silent consent. Stepping forward with calm and unwavering confidence, Jack addressed the assembly. "I'm not some random stranger. I grew up here. My father, Henry Turner, lived in that house for over 40 years, and he left it to me, legally. I have the will, the deed, and the full support of the county records office." His clear, measured words resonated through the room. As murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, Jack continued, "I've been nothing but respectful since I returned. I'm here to honor my father's legacy and contribute positively to our community." In that moment, it was evident that Karen's attempts to turn the town against him had backfired spectacularly. Jack left the meeting buoyed by the community's support, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, confident that with truth and determination on his side, no amount of intimidation could ever take away what was rightfully his. Stepping up to the podium in the town hall, Jack calmly spoke, addressing the room full of council members and town residents. "I've been nothing but respectful since I returned," he explained, his voice steady. "I followed every rule, cleaned up the property, and made every effort to integrate back into this community." He paused for a moment before continuing, his eyes briefly darting toward Karen, who was glaring at him from across the room, still seething from his earlier statements. "Meanwhile, Karen has called the cops on me, dumped garbage on my porch, filed false code violations, and spread lies about me all over town." The tension in the room escalated as Karen's face darkened, her cheeks turning a deep shade of red. "That's not true," she shouted, her voice rising with indignation. Jack raised an eyebrow, the corners of his lips curling into a hint of a smile. "Oh, really?" he said, his tone dripping with subtle humor. Should we ask Sheriff Coleman? He's got a record of everything. Or maybe we should ask Doug from Code Enforcement. He had a lovely time inspecting my non-existent violations." The crowd, which had been listening intently up to that point, began to chatter. Laughter rippled through the room. Jack let the laughter die down before continuing, his voice softening but his resolve forging through with clarity. "Look," he said, now addressing the council directly, "I'm not here to cause trouble. What I'm here for is simple, to stay. This house is my family's legacy, and I'm going to honor it. All I ask is to be given the same respect I've shown everyone else." There was a stunned silence that enveloped the room, but after a long, tense moment, one of the council members nodded slowly. "Well said, Mr. Turner," he acknowledged, his tone surprisingly approving. The meeting adjourned quickly after that. Karen, her face set in a rigid mask of frustration and defeat, stormed out of the room without meeting anyone's gaze. Jack, on the other hand, walked out of the town hall with a clear sense of accomplishment, feeling lighter, more grounded than he had in weeks. He wasn't just a new guy anymore. He had won over the people who mattered, and for the first time, Jack truly felt like he belonged. He had taken the first real step in reclaiming his place and honoring his father's dying wish to preserve the legacy of the home he'd always known. The weeks passed peacefully, slipping into a rhythm as Jack focused on breathing life into the house and the land that had remained untouched for far too long. Karen kept her distance, though Jack occasionally caught her glaring from across the street, her gaze cold and filled with resentment. Perhaps she was plotting her next move, but it no longer bothered him. If anything, he found it almost amusing. Her attempts to get under his skin only revealed how desperate she had become. He knew he wasn't going anywhere, and neither was his resolve. Much of his time was spent restoring the house, bringing back the warmth and charm it had once known. He painted the front porch, repaired the old furniture, and worked tirelessly to restore the garden his father had loved. The neighborhood seemed to take notice as neighbors dropped by to chat, offering word of advice or encouragement, as well as homemade pies. For each gesture, Jack felt a deep sense of gratitude, even if he hadn't expected this kind of support when he first arrived. One afternoon, as he tended to the freshly planted flowers along the front path, an older man named Frank shuffled over and leaned on the fence, a contemplative look on his face. "You know," Frank said thoughtfully, "I knew your dad pretty well. He was a good man, tough but fair. You're a lot like him." Jack smiled, pausing in his work. "Thanks. I'm just trying to do right by him." Frank nodded sagely. "You're doing a good job. And don't worry about Karen," he added, his tone light but meaningful. "She's all bark, no bite. She'll move on to someone else eventually. She always does." Jack chuckled, the familiar sense of humor lifting his spirit. "Let's hope so," he said. By the time summer rolled around, the house had transformed. The porch gleamed with freshly applied paint, the garden bloomed in vibrant colors, and the once empty rooms were now filled with the comforting presence of old furniture, reclaiming their place as part of this living legacy. Jack sat on the porch one warm, quiet evening, a cold beer in hand, watching the orange glow of the sunset fade into the dusk. As he took in the expansive view of the land, he thought about everything that had happened, the hardships, the struggles with Karen, and the strange journey that had brought him full circle back to this place. This house wasn't just a building, it was woven into the very fabric of his life, a piece of his history that he was now fully reclaiming. And as for Karen, she was still out there, lurking in the background, waiting for an opportunity. But Jack knew something for certain. No matter what came next, he could handle her. He wasn't the same man who had stood on the porch weeks ago, unsure of his place in the world. He had found his footing, his strength, and no matter what happened, this house was his. He wasn't going anywhere. For 26 seconds, walking out of the town hall, buoyed by the warm reception from his neighbors and the undeniable support of the community, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. Ever since that pivotal meeting, he had resolved to honor his father's legacy by integrating fully into the fabric of the town. He followed every rule, meticulously cleaned up his property, and made every effort to prove that he was not the troublemaker Karen so desperately claimed him to be. Yet, true to her vindictive nature, Karen continued her relentless campaign against him, calling the cops, dumping garbage on his porch, filing bogus code violations, and spreading nasty lies throughout town. At one point, as whispers rippled through a local gathering, someone cynically remarked, "Should we ask Sheriff Coleman? He's got a record of everything," while another joked about Doug from Code Enforcement having a field day inspecting Jack's so-called violations. Laughter burst from the crowd, but Jack's eyes narrowed in quiet indignation. With a calm yet resolute tone, he addressed the assembly. "I'm not here to cause trouble, I'm here to stay. This house is my family's legacy, and I intend to honor it. All I ask is that I be given the same respect I have shown to everyone in this community." For a heartbeat, silence fell over the room before one council member, nodding slowly, murmured, "Well said, Mr. Turner." Shortly thereafter, the meeting was adjourned, and Karen, unable to muster another retort, stormed out without meeting anyone's gaze. In the weeks that followed, the tension gradually subsided, and Jack began to truly feel at home again. Karen, though still present, kept her distance. However, every now and then, Jack caught sight of her glaring from across the street, a silent threat that, oddly enough, had become almost amusing to him. Instead of letting her constant harassment weigh him down, Jack threw himself into restoring his father's home. He repainted the front porch until it gleamed like new, repaired worn-out furniture with care, and breathed life back into the garden that his father had so dearly loved. Neighbors, noticing his earnest efforts, began to drop by, some with friendly smiles, others bearing homemade pies, and many offering tidbits of advice and words of encouragement. One bright afternoon, as Jack knelt in the garden planting fresh flowers along the front path, an older man named Frank ambled over. Leaning on the fence with a thoughtful expression, Frank said, "You know, I knew your dad pretty well. He was a good man, tough but fair. And you, Jack, you're a lot like him." Jack smiled, wiping the sweat from his brow, and replied, "Thanks, Frank. I'm just trying to do right by him." Frank nodded approvingly, adding, "You're doing a great job. And don't worry about Karen. She's all bark and no bite. She'll eventually move on to someone else, as she always does." Jack chuckled at the remark, a lightness returning to his heart that had been absent for so long. As summer gradually set in, the transformation of the property became undeniable. The porch, freshly painted, shone under the afternoon sun, the garden burst with vibrant, blooming flowers, and the rooms, once empty and echoing with memories of the past, now welcomed new furniture alongside relics of days gone by. One serene evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack sat on the porch with a cold beer in hand, watching the colors of the sunset play over the landscape. In that moment, he reflected on everything that had transpired: the loss of his father, the chaos stirred by Karen's relentless provocations, and the long, arduous journey that had brought him back to his roots. It wasn't the life he had imagined, but it was his, and it felt profoundly right. Though Karen continued to lurk in the background, waiting for her next chance to strike, Jack was no longer the uncertain man who had once stood at his father's doorstep. He had found his footing, built a new life, and embraced his heritage with unwavering resolve. No matter what challenges lay ahead, this was his home, a sacred piece of his past that he was determined to reclaim and protect, come what may. In today's world, we're often faced with adversity and challenges, just like Jack Turner was with Karen, but sometimes we need to remember that while people might try to push us down, we have the power to stand firm, move forward, and stay grounded in what truly matters. It's easy to get caught up in the noise of social media or people's judgments, but staying true to your values, honoring your own legacy, like Jack did with his father's house, can lead to unexpected support from those around you. Sure, not everyone will agree with you, and some will try to manipulate circumstances to their advantage. But if you stay resilient and focus on what you can control, you may just be surprised by who's on your side when you stand up for what's right. So how do you handle negativity from others in your life? Have you ever faced a situation where you felt like an underdog but eventually earned the respect of people around you? Let us know how you handled adversity in the comments below. How important do you think it is to stay true to your own path, even when others try to lead you astray for 8 seconds? The story of Jack Turner teaches us that resilience and determination can turn adversity into opportunity, even when faced with relentless opposition. In today's American society, it's crucial to stand up for what you believe in and honor your values, just as Jack did when defending his family's legacy. Instead of letting negativity derail your progress, focus on what you can control. Invest time in your personal growth, work hard to improve your situation, and maintain a record of your achievements. Integrating into your community is equally important. Building genuine relationships and supporting one another can create a strong network that helps you overcome challenges. Whether it's addressing unfair treatment at work, standing up against bullying, or simply advocating for what is right, every small victory counts. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to fight for what you believed was yours, even when the odds were against you? How did you manage to stay true to yourself and overcome the obstacles? What strategies have helped you maintain your integrity in the face of adversity? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Let's discuss how we can all harness our inner strength to build a better, more supportive community.